long before pyramids cast their shadows across the sands of Egypt, before marble temples rose in Greece, or legions marched through Rome. There was a land where humanity first tried to master time itself, a place where clay, water, and blood became the tools of creation and destruction. The land was called Sumer, to most of the world today. It's just a whisper buried beneath the deserts of southern Iraq, a forgotten plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But more than 6,000 years ago, this was the center of everything, the heartbeat of what we now call civilization. Sit back, relax, and imagine it. The year is around 4000 BC, the air is thick and humid. The riverbanks shimmer beneath the sun. Nomads, who once wandered aimlessly, begin to settle, shaping mud into bricks, stacking them into walls, and giving rise to the first true cities. Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, and your names that echo faintly from the dust, became the first sparks of organized life. Here, for the first time, humans recorded their thoughts, counted their crops, built temples that reached for heaven, and asked the question that would haunt every civilization to come: who gave us this power, and at what cost? Archaeologists call it the dawn of the Uruk period. Some see it as the moment the human story truly began. Others see it as the beginning of our curse, the point where we left harmony with nature and began chasing immortality through stone, conquest, and belief. It was here that writing was born, not for poetry, but for control. Clay tablets etched with cuneiform symbols tracked grain, trade, taxes, and gods. And so, civilization's first heartbeat was not art or faith, but order. Yet even in this order, chaos was never far. As cities rose, so did rivalries. As gods were named, wars were justified. From this fertile crescent, humanity stepped into its greatest experiment, one that would bring both light and ruin. Some scholars still debate, was Sumer truly the first? Or were others, like Egypt or the Indus Valley, evolving in secret, unseen by history's first scribes? The mystery endures, but one truth remains, somewhere between the rivers. Under layers of clay and silence lies the moment we stopped surviving and began to rule. In the heart of the Sumerian plains, one city rose higher, louder and prouder than all the rest. Its name was Uruk. To its people, it wasn't just a city, it was a living being, a vast breathing machine of stone, clay, and belief. Its walls, they said, were built by the semi-divine king Gilgamesh himself, 12 kilometers long, 50 feet high, glistening under the desert sun. From the top, one could see the endless floodplain stretching into a haze of gold and heat, where rivers twisted like serpents and fields shimmered green with barley. The air was thick with the smell of baked clay and animal sacrifice, the sound of chisel and prayer blending into a rhythm that defined life itself. Here, humanity made its first real attempt to speak to the heavens. Towering ziggurats, stepped temples that reached toward the sky, dominated the skyline, built to honor the gods who ruled every breath of life. The god Anu, lord of the heavens, the storm god Enlil, whose temper brought floods, and the radiant Inanna, the queen of heaven, goddess of love and war, whose power could bless or destroy with equal grace. The people believed that their prosperity depended on pleasing these gods, and so they built higher, prayed harder, and sacrificed deeper. It was faith, but it was also fear. In the heat of summer, when the rivers swelled and devoured the fields, it was said the gods were angry. When the rains failed and dust swallowed the crops, the gods were distant. Everything, every harvest, every life was tied to divine will. And yet, beneath that faith, something else was growing: control. The priests, the keepers of divine order, began to rule beside the kings. They recorded omens, managed the grain, and dictated rituals in the name of the gods. Civilization was no longer just survival. It was obedience. Archaeologists uncovering Uruk's ruins have found tablets that speak of trade stretching far beyond the horizon: copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon. Uruk had become a world power before the world even knew what that meant. But as the city expanded, so too did its hunger. It needed more water, more labor, more faith. And in its shadow, the first cracks of ambition began to show. Some say Uruk was not just the cradle of civilization, it was the cradle of human pride. And every empire since has carried its echo. Long before kings and temples, before writing or war, there was the river. The Tigris and Euphrates, twin veins of muddy lifeblood flowing through the desert, shaped everything that would come to be known as civilization. To the ancients, these rivers were not just bodies of water. They were gods themselves, wild and unpredictable. One year they flooded and blessed the fields. The next they destroyed entire villages overnight. The people learned to build canals, levees, and reservoirs, carving order out of chaos. It was here that humanity first learned to control nature, or perhaps to pretend it could. The smell of wet earth filled the air as farmers guided wooden plows through the rich soil, oxen groaning beneath the weight. The sound of rushing water echoed across the plains, mingling with the distant chants of priests offering prayers to keep the floods at bay. In those early centuries, survival depended on rhythm, the rhythm of the river, the stars, the seasons. When the river gave too much, they thanked it. When it took too much, they begged forgiveness. And through this cycle of gratitude and fear, something profound began to form: memory. The river became the first archive, its banks a living record of human endurance. Layer upon layer of mud and clay buried the remnants of villages, tools, and temples, each telling a silent story of people who learned, adapted, and began again. Archaeologists today still find shards of pottery, the faint outlines of irrigation channels, and fragments of reeds that once recorded prayers to the gods of water. These relics speak of minds that began to wonder, what if the floods weren't chance, but fate? What if destiny flowed like the river, carving unseen paths through time? In that thought, the seeds of religion and science alike were born. The Tigris and Euphrates were mirrors, reflecting the human struggle for balance between nature and control, faith and reason, destruction and renewal. Even now, as the desert winds whistle through the ruins of Sumer, the ancient canals can still be traced from above, pale scars across a landscape that once shimmered with life. And one can't help but wonder, did the river remember us, or are we only remembering it? Because every civilization that came after Egypt on the Nile, India on the Indus, China on the Yellow River, followed the same eternal current that to master water is to master life, but only for a moment, deep within the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary: not gold, not jewels, but clay. Thousands upon thousands of tablets, each inscribed with tiny wedge-shaped marks. To the untrained eye, they looked like meaningless scratches, but these marks were the beginning of something that would outlive empires: writing. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians discovered that clay could hold more than shape. It could hold thought. They called their script cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. What began as a tool for counting grain and livestock soon evolved into something far greater, a system to record stories, laws, prayers, and dreams. In those early days, a scribe's hands were as powerful as a king's sword. Every stroke of the stylus was deliberate, every line a binding contract with the future. The smell of wet clay filled the air in the dim rooms of temples, where scribes bent over tablets by the flickering light of oil lamps, their rhythmic tapping echoing like the heartbeat of civilization. For the first time, memory became immortal. Words no longer vanished with the speaker. They could be passed on, copied, carried across lands and centuries. It was here that myth met permanence. The stories of Gilgamesh, of gods and floods, of kings and curses, all etched into clay that would one day turn to stone. The invention of writing transformed everything it touched. It birthed bureaucracy, economy, religion, and empire. Priests recorded offerings, traders logged their cargo, rulers decreed laws that none could ignore. Knowledge became a weapon, guarded by the educated few. Civilization itself became a network of symbols, each one binding people to systems of power and belief. But writing also gave rise to something unintended: history. For the first time, humans began to record not just what they did, but who they were. They began to see patterns, to measure time, to recognize their place in something vast and unfolding. The clay spoke not just of kings, but of bakers, farmers, and builders of lives now lost to dust. When you look at a tablet from Uruk today, its edges cracked, its script faded. You can still trace the marks of the hand that made it, a voice reaching out across 5,000 years, whispering the same truth civilization has always known. Memory is the only thing that defies death. Long before the glass towers and neon lights of our modern world, the first cities rose quietly from the dust of the southern Mesopotamian plains. They began as clusters of huts along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. But as the centuries passed, something shifted. People began to stay. They built walls. They organized. They dreamed of permanence. By 4000 BC, Sumer had given rise to the first true city, Uruk. Imagine it, the scent of baked clay and incense drifting through the air, the hum of thousands of voices echoing through narrow streets. Mud brick homes stacked tightly together, their walls plastered with straw and silt. Canals snaked through the heart of the settlement, carrying water to the fields beyond the walls. At the city's center, rising like a mountain of stone and faith, stood the ziggurat, a temple built not just for worship, but as a bridge between earth and sky. Here priests read the movements of the stars, interpreting divine messages for kings and farmers alike. Around them, life pulsed in rhythm with the river. Potters shaping clay, merchants weighing silver, and scribes scratching cuneiform onto tablets while the lowing of cattle echoed in the distance. Uruk was unlike anything the world had seen. It wasn't simply a collection of people. It was an organism, living, breathing, consuming. It drew resources from miles away, trading with distant lands like Elam and Dilmun, exchanging grain and wool for copper, lapis lazuli, and resin. The city became a mirror of the human mind, complex, layered, and insatiably curious. With it came laws, hierarchies, and the first whispers of empire. But there was a cost. The walls that kept danger out also kept the poor in. The ziggurat's shadow fell over both the faithful and the forgotten. The city's success depended on control of water, of people, of stories. And yet, amid the dust and the noise, something extraordinary was happening. Humanity had found its rhythm, the cycle of creation and destruction, of chaos and order, of progress and decay. Each brick laid in Uruk was a promise that we could build something eternal. But deep down, the Sumerians must have known that nothing eternal stays standing forever. As the sun set behind the ziggurat and the last traders shuttered their stalls, Uruk glowed beneath the stars, a fragile heartbeat in the vast darkness. Unaware that it had just begun the story every civilization would one day repeat. In the beginning, there were no kings, only priests and elders who spoke for the gods and guided the people. But as cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Kish swelled with life, order began to strain under its own weight. The rivers that gave them prosperity could just as easily drown them, and enemies from the deserts and mountains eyed the fertile plains with envy. So the people turned to a new kind of leader, not a holy man, but a warrior. From this chaos rose the first kings, men who claimed that the gods themselves had chosen them to rule. They called this divine authority the Me, the sacred order of civilization, and with it they justified conquest, labor, and law. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, became the archetype, part man, part god, a builder of walls, a seeker of immortality, and a tyrant who learnt the cost of power. His story, carved in clay, became more than myth. It was prophecy, for in every king that followed, the same hunger lived. Kings turned cities into kingdoms and farmers into soldiers. Armies marched under the banners of Inanna, Enlil, and Onu, claiming to fight for divine purpose, but bleeding for earthly gain. The priests blessed their battles, the scribes recorded their victories, and the people bowed beneath the weight of both crown and God. With kings came monuments, palaces lined with copper, temples carved with stories of divine favor, and boundary stones that declared the extent of their glory. But behind every wall was fear. Kings ruled by the sword, and the moment they faltered, rivals rose from within. Civil wars tore through the plains, and the same canals that once nourished crops now ran red with blood. Yet, paradoxically, it was through this violence that civilization advanced. Each ruler, in his thirst for dominance, commissioned new inventions, better irrigation, more complex writing, stronger fortifications. Out of ambition came innovation. Out of conquest came culture. But the gods, fickle and silent, never answered their kings' prayers. For every golden age that dawned, a shadow followed close behind. The Sumerians built the first kingdoms not because they were ready for power, but because they could no longer survive without it. And so, beneath the heat of the Mesopotamian sun, the age of divine kings began, an age that would echo across empires for thousands of years, teaching humanity that the hand which builds a crown also sharpens a blade, rising above the flat expanse of mud-brick cities. The ziggurats of Sumer stood like mountains of clay reaching toward the heavens. To the Sumerians, these colossal step temples were not just architecture, they were bridges between the mortal and the divine, stairways for gods to descend and for priests to ascend. Each city-state had its own ziggurat, its own guardian deity, and its own sacred rituals performed high above the ordinary lives of the people below. In Ur, the great ziggurat of Nana shimmered under the desert sun, its baked bricks painted with lapis lazuli and copper, glinting like a beacon of devotion. At dawn, priests climbed its steep terraces, carrying incense and offerings, whispering hymns in the world's first written language, their chants drifting across the plains like the breath of the gods themselves. The people believed the ziggurat's summit housed the gods' dwelling, a place forbidden to all but the high priests who acted as intermediaries between heaven and earth. These temples were not merely symbols of faith, they were the engines of society. Surrounding them were storehouses filled with grain, workshops of artisans, schools for scribes, and courts for settling disputes. Religion was not separate from daily life, was daily life. Every harvest, every flood, every victory in battle was credited to divine favor, and every misfortune was interpreted as wrath from above. The gods were Menianu, ruler of the heavens, Enlil, lord of air and storm, Inanna, goddess of love and war, and Enki, the wise god of the deep waters and hidden knowledge. Each demanded devotion, sacrifice, and ritual precision. Even the positioning of a temple or the timing of a ceremony could determine whether the gods smiled or cursed. Beneath this spiritual structure lay fear and awe in equal measure. The people prayed not because they were hopeful, but because they were desperate to survive in a world of uncertain floods and relentless heat. The ziggurat reminded them daily of their smallness, yet it also gave them purpose, the belief that their labor and worship sustained the universe itself. And as the centuries passed, even as kings rose and fell, these temples endured, standing as silent witnesses to humanity's first attempt to reach the divine. But with every offering and every whispered prayer, one question remained: were the gods truly listening? Or were the Sumerians only building towers of devotion that reached no further than the clouds? In the southern reaches of Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates once carved its silver path through the dust, rose the city of your majestic, wealthy, and alive with the rhythm of civilization. To walk its narrow streets was to hear the pulse of early urban life, the clatter of bronze tools, the chants of merchants haggling over wool and grain, the low murmur of scribes etching clay tablets with cuneiform script that recorded debts, births, and offerings to the gods. The air was thick with the scent of burning oil lamps and the earthy musk of clay bricks still warm from the sun. Around the city's heart stood great walls of baked mud, their massive gates guarded by sentinels carrying spears tipped in copper. Within those walls, life unfolded in layers of order and devotion. The towering ziggurat of Nana dominated the skyline, its steps crawling upward toward a gleaming temple where priests read omens in the stars. At its base, commoners offered barley, fish, and incense, hoping their god might grant fertile fields and calm waters. The city's wealth flowed from its mastery of trade boats drifted down the rivers carrying lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and gold from Anatolia. Yours merchants were the silent conquerors of their age, their clay contracts and seals the precursors of modern economics. But for all its splendor, Yor was also fragile. Its prosperity built on the mercy of rivers that could flood or dry without warning. The people had learned to build canals, to measure water levels, to appeal to gods when reason failed. Each dawn, the city awoke to the hum of industry, potters shaping vessels from wet earth, metal workers hammering bronze, and scribes teaching young apprentices the sacred geometry of language. At night, the streets fell silent except for the distant hymns rising from the ziggurat, echoing through the warm, dry air. To the people of Yor, theirs was not merely a city but the center of the world, the axis around which gods and men revolved. Yet even as its walls gleamed in the moonlight, unseen forces were already at work shifting riverbeds, rising powers, and the slow decay that time brings to all great things. The question that lingered was not how yore had risen to such heights, but how long its brilliance could endure before the sands reclaimed it once more. For centuries, the Sumerians had mastered the rivers, bending the will of the Tigris and Euphrates to nourish their cities. But power, as it always does, began to turn against its creators. The same waters that had brought life to the plains of Mesopotamia now whispered destruction. Floods grew unpredictable, salt crept into the fields, and harvests began to fail. The once fertile soil hardened, glimmering white under the sun, poisoned by centuries of irrigation. The rivers shifted course, abandoning ancient canals, and the cities that had once been jewels of civilization began to choke in the dust. Yet the decline of Sumer was not only written in the soil, it was carved into the hearts of its people. Internal strife brewed between city-states like your Lagash and Kish, each vying for supremacy under the banner of different gods. Armies marched across the plains, their bronze weapons clashing under the unrelenting heat, spilling blood onto land that could no longer feed them. In the ziggurats, priests continued their rituals, but even they sensed the silence of the heavens. The gods, it seemed, had turned their gaze elsewhere. Traders who once brought exotic goods from distant lands now carried news of famine and rebellion. The great temples that once glowed with offerings began to empty, their walls cracking as the wind carried away the dust of prayers unanswered. When the Akkadians rose to power under Sargon the Great, they absorbed what remained of Sumer, taking its gods, its language, and its secrets, but even they could not escape the curse of decline. The rivers that gave birth to civilization were indifferent to its glory. They flowed on, carving new paths while old cities crumbled. Archaeologists today find their remains, broken tablets, shattered idols, and the foundations of long-buried ziggurat silent testaments to the fragility of human achievement. Some scholars believe environmental collapse was the final blow. Others suggest invasion, drought, or the slow decay of over-reliance on systems too complex to sustain. Whatever the cause, Sumer fell quietly, not with a single cataclysm, but with a long sigh fading of voices, a dimming of fires, a civilization returning to the dust from which it came. And as centuries passed, the memory of Sumer dissolved into legend, until only the stones and the stars remembered that once, in a land between two rivers, humanity first learned to call itself civilized, while Sumer was fading beneath the weight of its own brilliance. Far to the west, another power was awakening, civilization born not from chaos, but from the rhythm of a single river. Egypt's story began along the banks of the Nile, where each year the waters would rise, spill over their edges, and retreat, leaving behind rich black silt. It was this annual miracle that gave Egypt its heartbeat, a predictable cycle of life and renewal that the people saw as divine. The Nile was not merely a river, it was a god, a teacher, and a lifeline. Where Mesopotamia battled floods and droughts, Egypt thrived in stability. The people learned to work with nature rather than against it, and from that harmony rose a civilization of astonishing scale and endurance. Villages grew into towns, and towns into cities connected by trade, belief, and the steady pulse of the Nile. Pharaohs emerged as divine rulers, seen as living gods who could speak the will of the heavens into law. They commanded great armies, vast resources, and the devotion of millions. But their greatest legacy was not conquest, it was order. The Egyptians called it matter, cosmic balance of truth, justice, and harmony that governed both earth and sky. Every farmer, every scribe, every builder was a thread in that great tapestry. In the glow of the sun, men carved stone blocks that weighed as much as small houses, dragging them across the sands to raise monuments that would outlast empires. The pyramids of Giza stood as declarations of divine permanence, their perfect geometry aligned with the stars. Hieroglyphs bloomed on temple walls, telling stories of gods, kings, and journeys into the afterlife. And while Sumer's gods had been many and often fickle, Egypt's pantheon felt more ordered, each deity a reflection of natural forces: Ra, the sun; Osiris, the afterlife; Isis, the mother of magic. The Nile's calm cycles had shaped their very souls, yet beneath the beauty and order, there was always a shadow, the understanding that death was not the end, but a passage. The Egyptians built for eternity because they knew time was not a straight line, but a circle. The river would rise again, the sun would return, and so too would the soul. And thus Egypt rose where Sumer had fallen, carried by a river that promised rebirth in every tide. In ancient Egypt, death was not feared, was studied, prepared for, and even celebrated. To the Egyptians, life was only the beginning of a greater journey, one that continued beyond the horizon where the sun set into the underworld. Every act, every ritual, every carving on a tomb wall was part of a vast spiritual equation designed to ensure safe passage into eternity. The pharaohs built their pyramids not merely as monuments of power, but as vehicles for resurrection. Within the hidden chambers, narrow shafts aligned perfectly with stars believed to guide the soul of the king to the heavens. Walls were painted with scenes of the afterlife fields of eternal grain, boats sailing on celestial waters, and gods weighing the hearts of men against the feather of truth. The air inside these tombs must have been thick with incense and mystery as priests chanted spells from the Book of the Dead, their voices echoing softly through the stone corridors. For the common people, the afterlife was simpler but no less sacred. They too hoped to cross the river of darkness and awaken in the field of reeds, a perfect reflection of Egypt where they could farm, love, and live forever. Death, in this culture, was not an interruption but a continuation, and so they mummified their dead with carry-moving organs, preserving the flesh, wrapping the body in linen bandages soaked in resin and oil. It was an act of devotion, a way of keeping the spirit tethered to the body long enough for its journey to begin. The scent of natron salt and lotus oil hung in the air as embalmers worked in silence, performing a ritual that blurred the line between science and sorcery. The result was astonishing. Bodies that have survived thousands of years, gazing back at us through the veil of time. In those preserved faces, one can almost feel the Egyptian defiance of death itself, their belief that the soul, if properly honored, could outlast empires. Their entire civilization revolved around this faith in permanence, in order, in cosmic harmony, and perhaps that is why Egypt endured when others vanished into the dust. The people of the Nile had mastered not only the art of living, but the art of forever, and in their pursuit of immortality, they etched their story into stoneware, even now, under the desert sun. It refuses to fade. The pyramids of Egypt rise from the sands like a dream carved in stone, their edges sharp against the horizon, their silence heavier than the desert air itself. To stand before them is to confront something beyond comprehension of civilization's attempt to reach the divine through geometry, labor, and faith. These colossal monuments were built more than 4,000 years ago, and yet they still defy explanation. How did a people armed with copper tools and ropes lift stones weighing several tons, align them with the stars, and arranged them into forms so precise that modern engineers still debate their secrets. Some believe tens of thousands of laborers worked in disciplined teams, living in organized camps with food, medical care, and a shared purpose that bound them together under the eye of the pharaoh. Others whisper of techniques, long forgotten levitation theories, lost technologies, or knowledge passed down from civilizations even older than Egypt itself. What is certain is that the pyramids were far more than tombs. They were machines of eternity, designed to unite heaven and earth, man and God, time and infinity. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the largest of them all, was aligned with true north to an accuracy unmatched for millennia. Inside its narrow corridors, chambers rise and fall like veins through a body of stone. The walls, though plain, radiate a sense of mathematical perfection or harmony that feels almost supernatural. When the wind moves across the plateau of Giza, it seems to hum faintly against the limestone blocks, as if the pyramids themselves are still breathing. Even now, the desert has not claimed them. Sand gathers around their bases, but the tips still pierce the sky, catching the same light that once shone on their creators. Every era has tried to explain their existence, but none have truly captured their meaning. Perhaps they were not meant to be understood in the way we seek to understand. Perhaps they were meant to be felt to remind those who look upon them that humanity once reached for eternity and almost touched it. The pyramids are the last whisper of a time when stone and spirit were one, when the measure of greatness was not in conquest, but in the power to build something that would never die. Long before the printing press, before books or even alphabets, humanity learned to carve thought into matter. Writing was not just invention, it was revelation, a bridge between mind and eternity. In Sumer, scribes pressed reeds into wet clay, shaping the wedge-shaped marks we now call cuneiform. Each stroke carried meaning, each symbol a fragment of order wrestled from chaos. At first, it was used for simple things, counting grain, recording debts, tracking offerings to the gods. But slowly, the marks became language, and language became history. Across the sands of time, the same miracle occurred in Egypt, where hieroglyphs bloomed like sacred art along the walls of temples and tombs. Each symbol was alive, infused with spirit. The Egyptians called their script Medu Neter, the words of the gods. To write was not merely to communicate, but to create, to summon divine power into form. The hieroglyph of an eye did not represent an eye, it was the eye, watching, eternal. To read these symbols was to enter a different realm of consciousness, where sound, image, and magic intertwined. Scribes were revered as keepers of cosmic truth. In both Egypt and Sumer, they formed an elite class, the first intellectuals of human civilization. They sat cross-legged over tablets and papyrus, guided by ritual precision and a sense of destiny. A single mistake could change meaning, alter a spell, or distort a prayer. Their writings preserved laws, hymns, astronomy, medicine, and myth. They wrote of kings who ruled the earth, of gods who ruled the stars, of floods that cleansed the world, and of dreams that foretold the future. When their civilizations fell, their scripts were buried too, locked away in silence for thousands of years. It was not until 1799, with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, that modern humans began to hear their voices again. Through its trilingual carvings, the lost language of the pharaohs began to whisper once more, revealing a story that had waited in stone for millennia. The birth of writing was the birth of memory. It transformed sound into permanence, fleeting thought into legacy, and through it, the first civilizations achieved what even gods might envy: the power to speak across the ages, to whisper to us still from the dust of time. In the blazing heart of Mesopotamia, where the horizon rippled with heat and dust, the first monuments of human faith rose toward the skies, massive stairways of baked clay that seemed to defy gravity and time. These were not merely temples, but cosmic mountains built to bridge the realms of man and the gods. Each level climbed closer to divinity, each brick a prayer in solid form. To the people below, these structures shimmered in the sunlight, vast and otherworldly, casting shadows that stretched across entire cities. At dawn, priests would ascend their steep steps, carrying offerings of grain, oil, and incense, their voices rising in chants that merged with the wind. The air smelled of fire and earth, of devotion and dust. The ziggurat of yore, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was one of the greatest, a towering mass of layered terraces. Each one dyed a different hue, each level guarded by carved lions and winged spirits. From its summit, one could see the entire city laid out like a map of human ambition, canals winding like veins, courtyards alive with traders and servants, walls etched with the language of kings. The ziggurat was the axis of their world, the point where heaven touched earth. And yet, these were not the only sanctuaries of ancient power. Farther west, along the Nile, temples rose in symmetry and grace, their columns carved with lotus and papyrus, their walls glowing with stories of gods and pharaohs intertwined. To step inside was to enter eternity itself. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of incense and the whisper of prayers. Light filtered through narrow openings, illuminating faces of gods that seemed to breathe. Every inch of stone told a story of creation, of death, of rebirth. These temples were not simply places of worship. They were living organisms designed to mirror the universe's order. The high priests, like the Sumerian scribes, were guardians of balance. They interpreted the movements of stars, the flow of the river, the will of unseen forces. Civilization itself revolved around these sacred centers, bound by awe and fear. When the last torch burned low each night, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was reverence. For even in their stillness, the ziggurats and temples whispered of something eternal, the ancient human desire to rise above the dust and speak to the heavens, beneath the towering temples and royal palaces. The true pulse of ancient civilization flowed through an invisible network, an intricate web of trade, communication, and shared invention that bound distant worlds together long before the word globalization was ever spoken. To imagine these connections is to see a map drawn not with borders, but with lines of movement, caravans crossing golden deserts, ships gliding through turquoise seas, and merchants carrying secrets as precious as their wares. The Mesopotamians traded with the Indus Valley long before history was written, exchanging lapis lazuli for grain, copper for textiles, knowledge for mystery. Somewhere between the Euphrates and the Indus, civilizations began to breathe in rhythm with one another, synchronized through necessity and curiosity. Systems theory would later describe this as a complex network, but to the ancient mind it was something closer to destiny. Each city, each empire, was a node in a vast living organism that thrived on interaction. Gold mined in Nubia might adorn a statue in Babylon. A mathematical principle from Egypt might find its echo in China centuries later. The Silk Road, long before it had a name, became the artery of human ambition, carrying spices, silk, and stories from one end of the known world to the other. Through this web, Ideas of God's governance and geometry traveled farther than armies ever could. Yet, for all its brilliance, this system was fragile. Empires rose and fell like waves in the same current they helped create. A drought in one region could unravel economies thousands of miles away. A war between rival kings could choke the flow of goods, sending entire cities into decline. Even in ancient times, humanity learned that greatness was never isolated. It was built upon the cooperation and competition of others. Some theorists, like David Wilkinson, would later suggest that this interconnectedness marked the birth of what he called the central civilization, the nucleus from which modern global society emerged. Others argue that it began much earlier, when the first trade routes stitched the fates of strangers together across barren lands and open seas. Whatever its origin, this invisible architecture remains humanity's oldest legacy, the network of minds, hands, and hearts that turned isolated tribes into a single, restless species forever reaching outward. Every civilization carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. What begins as a surge of creation, of vision and triumph, slowly bends under the weight of its own complexity. Historians have long searched for the pattern, the moment when growth turns into decay, when the pulse of progress begins to falter. To Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian, it was a cycle as natural as life itself. Empires rise on the vigor of their people, thrive through discipline and unity, then rot as luxury replaces purpose. The warriors become bureaucrats, the builders become caretakers, and the fire that once forged greatness cools into complacency. In the deserts beyond the walls, new forces gather, waiting for the cracks to widen. Edward Gibbon, writing of Rome's demise, saw this pattern as inevitable, the price of greatness itself. To him, Rome was not conquered from without, but consumed from within, its own triumphs breeding the decadence that would destroy it. Joseph Tainter later translated this into the language of systems and energy, arguing that complexity itself has diminishing returns. The more intricate a civilization becomes, the more fragile it grows. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the machine exceeds what the people can bear, and the gears grind to a halt. Others, like Jared Diamond, pointed to the environment, the slow exhaustion of forests, the silting of rivers, the hunger that creeps unseen until it swallows whole cities. Civilizations, in his view, collapse not because they are conquered, but because they fail to listen to the earth that sustains them. Yet collapse is never total. It is transformation disguised as ruin. The fall of one empire becomes the soil for another. The ashes of the Bronze Age gave rise to the Iron, and from the Dark Ages emerged the spark of modernity. It is as though history itself breathes exhaling destruction, inhaling rebirth. Still, in the silence that follows each fall, one hears a haunting refrain. Can progress ever last? Or is every age doomed to crumble beneath its own ambition? The ruins of Rome, of yore, of Teotihuacan, whisper the same truth the higher we climb, the farther there is to fall. And yet, humanity keeps building, keeps reaching, as if compelled by a memory older than history itself. When cultural historian Maurice Berman looked at the modern United States, he did not see a civilization at its peak, but one standing on the edge of exhaustion. In his view, the same forces that had once made America powerful, its restless individualism, its hunger for expansion, its relentless pursuit of wealth, had twisted into the very instruments of its decline. The empire of opportunity had become an empire of consumption. Its cities hum with energy, yet beneath the neon lights lies a deep fatigue, a hollowness masked by noise and screens. Like Rome before its fall, America has grown vast, wealthy, and distracted, forgetting that no civilization can thrive when its foundations rot from within. Berman warned of a hollowed economy, of crumbling communities, of widening chasms between rich and poor. He saw not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling, a civilization quietly consuming itself. Urban planner Jane Jacobs echoed that alarm, describing 5 pillars that once upheld American culture, family, and community: education, science, government, and self-regulation, now weakened by greed and disconnection. Without them, the social fabric frays, and what remains is motion without meaning. The philosopher Derrick Jensen went further still, arguing that civilization itself, not just America's, inherently self-destructive. Built on extraction, conquest, and endless growth, every civilization eventually devours the world that sustains it. To live densely, to require constant importation of food, water, and energy, is to set a timer on your own survival. The greater the cities rise, the greater their need for control, for military power, for walls both visible and invisible. And as history shows, walls do not save. Each theorist points to the same haunting pattern: civilization as a paradox, where the seeds of advancement carry the code of decay. Some say this is the natural course of things, the price of progress. Others suggest it is a choicer path humanity could change, if only it dared. But if the lessons of Sumer, of Rome, of every empire since tell us anything, it is that civilizations rarely see their own endings coming. The lights do not go out all at once. They dim slowly, unnoticed, until the silence feels normal and the ruins begin to look like home. Every civilization that has fallen has left behind 2 legacies: the ruins that mark its failure, and the ideas that survive it. When Sumer fell, it did not vanish, it diffused. Its writing, its myths, its mathematics flowed outward into the empires that followed, like embers carried by wind. Egypt's monuments still whisper of a structure so precise that even its decay inspires awe. Rome's laws, though born of conquest, became the bones of the modern West. Collapse, then, is not always annihilation, it is metamorphosis. Arnold Toynbee, the great historian of civilization, argued that every culture rises in response to a challenge and dies when it ceases to respond creatively. It is not the hardship that destroys. It is the failure to adapt. When the ruling class grows too rigid, when imagination dies, collapse follows, not because the walls fall, but because the spirit inside them does. In that sense, collapse is not a single event, but a process, and erosion of vitality, a forgetting of purpose. It creeps like rust, spreading through politics, art, and faith until nothing new can grow. Yet from the ashes, new life always emerges. After Rome's fall came the monasteries, silent keepers of knowledge. After Europe's dark centuries came the Renaissance, a rebirth of light from the manuscripts preserved by the forgotten. Collapse clears the ground. It forces humanity to remember what truly matters. Even in our modern age, where machines hum louder than the human heart, the same rhythm continues. The world is not ending. It is transforming. The digital empire, with its invisible infrastructure of code and connection, mirrors the old empires of stone and steel. It too extracts, expands, and consumes. And like them, it too will reach its point of exhaustion. But beyond that exhaustion may lie renewal, rediscovery of meaning beyond progress, beyond profit. For collapse is not the enemy. Stagnation is the death of a civilization is only the death of its illusions. And in that death there is a strange kind of hope, that humanity might finally listen to the quiet, persistent pulse beneath history, the one that whispers that no empire is eternal and that from every ruin, something wiser can still be born. Beneath every modern city, beneath the steel, the concrete, and the endless noise, lie the bones of the forgotten. Layers of time compressed like pages of an unread book. Archaeologists dig not only for artifacts, but for fragments of memory shards of pottery, half-buried temples, a child's toy hardened by centuries of dust. Each discovery is an awakening, a voice from the deep past whispering, "We were here too, in the deserts of Uruk, where the Tigris and Euphrates once roared with life. The ruins of your Uruk and Eridu still sleep under blankets of sand. The air there feels heavy with remembrance, as though the land itself is reluctant to let go of what it once nurtured. The bricks still bear the fingerprints of workers who lived 5,000 years ago, their sweat mixed with clay, their breath now lost to the wind. When the archaeologist brushes away the dust, she is not simply uncovering a wall, she is resurrecting a world. And yet, what is uncovered is never the full story. So much of the past is unrecorded, dissolved by time, swallowed by water, or burned by conquest. What remains are fragments, and it is within those fragments that the imagination must wander. Every piece of broken pottery becomes a question. Every ancient inscription, an unfinished sentence. In a sense, archaeology is not just science, it is communion. It bridges the dead and the living. When we gaze upon a Sumerian tablet, when we read the earliest laws carved in cuneiform, we are not simply observing the past, we are participating in it. We are continuing the dialogue that began when the first human pressed a reed into wet clay and decided that their thoughts were worth preserving. Even the silence of ruins speaks. It tells us that memory is fragile, that civilizations are temporary, but that meaning, once created, never truly dies. The earth becomes an archive of everything humanity has ever dared to build, dream, and destroy. And as the excavator's brush moves carefully over the dust, there is always that same feeling of awe, of melancholy, of connection, that perhaps beneath our own cities, beneath our own noise, future hands will one day uncover the story of us and wonder who we were and why we fell silent when we speak of the world's oldest civilization. We are really asking something deeper. When did humanity first decide that survival was not enough? That to live meant more than to eat, drink, and sleep beneath the stars? Somewhere between the rivers of Mesopotamia, this transformation occurred. The Sumerians were the first to build cities, but more than that, they were the first to imagine permanence. They looked at the wild earth and saw not just a place to live, but a place to build meaning. Their temples rose toward the heavens, their laws etched order into chaos, their myths gave purpose to existence. But as we circle back to that question, who was truly first, we find the answer dissolving like mist at dawn. Egypt claims an ancient lineage, its tombs defying the centuries. The Indus Valley whispers of forgotten scripts, silent yet monumental. China's Yellow River tells its own tale of early dynasties shaping the course of human destiny. Each land, in its own rhythm, declares, "We were the beginning," and maybe, in a way, they all were. Because civilization is not a moment, it is a pulse, a slow awakening across the world. While Sumer carved its stories into clay, others built in stone, others in silence, others in ritual and memory. Civilization was not born in one place. It unfolded like a dawn, touching different horizons at different hours. Yet there is something hauntingly special about Sumer. Its name feels older than language, its ruins older than memory. Even its myths seem to echo the first questions humanity ever asked. Who are we? Why are we here? And what happens when we are gone? The Epic of Gilgamesh, their greatest story, ends not with victory, but with realization that no wall, no temple, no kingdom can outlast time. Only the story endures. And perhaps that is the final truth of civilization. It is not the bricks or the empires that define it, but the stories that desire to be remembered. When the rivers dry, when the cities crumble, when the gods fall silent, it is the story that remains. The story of people who looked at the world, saw it was vast and mysterious, and decided to write themselves into it. Maybe that's why we keep searching for the oldest civilization. Because in the ruins of Sumer, in the dust of forgotten cities, we aren't just looking for them, we're looking for the first version of ourselves.